Following up on those questions raised by Father Frank Brennan, can I just go to the concerns each of you have in relation to these laws? And I'll start with you, Your Grace. What actually keeps you awake at night over this? What's your biggest concern?
Well, that in fact it amounts to a serious erosion of what I judge to be a genuinely human society. Again, I'm concerned for individuals. At heart, I'm a pastor, whatever else I'm called. But as a human being, I think that this kind of legislation with its slippery language, where you have words like dignity and compassion and freedom used, and used a great deal, but not always in a transparent way, and sometimes they conceal something quite different. I can't see I'm all for human dignity and compassion and freedom. Surely we all are. But I can't for the life of me see how the legislation that is proposed in Queensland, which is likely to be even more liberal than the legislation passed in Western Australia, which in turn was more liberal than the legislation in Victoria. There seems to be a pattern of the kind that Frank Brennan was referring to. We haven't yet seen the legislation in draft here, though it's coming more quickly than we expected. We've only just discovered. So that's the thing that most troubles me, that in claiming to create a society in which dignity and compassion and freedom are protected and enshrined and advanced, I think we might in fact be doing the opposite. So that with the best of intention, and there are many examples of this in history, we end up doing the exact opposite of the very thing we had in mind.
Jane?
So that's my overarching concern. There are many others that flow from it.
Jane, what's your overarching concern? Do you have?
My overarching concern is that this isn't a binary process. You know, it's not like you're facing a terminal illness, are you okay, or are you not okay, therefore we'll have VAD. And we've heard about palliative care, but we haven't acknowledged high rates of depression, existential distress in people at end of life. Now, the data in Victoria is terrifying. 136 people sought VAD. 3 were deemed ineligible, and ineligibility relates to the forecast prognosis, but also apparently excludes people with serious mental illness like depression. Yeah. And up to 50% of people with terminal illness have depression. So it's extraordinary that those people weren't seen as depressed or excluded. The data from Canada is equally concerning, and we talk about language. It's called MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying. It somehow sounds rather cosy and nice. Now, they have a 10-day cooling off period between requesting that and enacting, and that's dispensed, not infrequently, for no obvious reason. In Canada, there has been legislation now to allow organ donation after assisted dying, and some people have actually advocated that organs could be removed before death is enacted in order to keep them in pristine condition. I guess my biggest concern is the slippery slope, and people negate that. But in Belgium, people can be euthanized because of mental illness. In Australia, we have a terrible, terrible history of decimating First Nations people. And I worry terribly that if we can administer VAD, we will negate help seeking and healthcare seeking from our Indigenous population.
All right, so can I go there straight to Darlene on that? Do you worry about the impact of this on First Nations people?
Absolutely, and thank you, Jane. It's good to segue off that. I've just written here, my mind boggles with the amount of energy and resources necessarily turned towards this discussion on VAD and all the discussions. When we have two groups of, you know, the First Nations people of this land who have yet to live fully, and in their own words, I think they would say to flourish fully in their own land. So I hear what you said, Jane, and I concur.
Okay, so Samantha, on this, and Jane mentioned mental disability overseas. In most jurisdictions, certainly in Australia, disability or mental illness is not an eligibility criteria. Why isn't that enough protection?
Well, I would arguably be eligible, so all disabilities come from a medical condition. So, I have a condition called limb-girdle muscular dystrophy type 2I, which I'm horrified to hear about the numbers of access in Victoria, because, what does that look like in Victoria for disabled people and older people who are having their lives devalued every single day, with people arguing for freedoms around COVID, in a pandemic, where it's okay because it's just going to be the old people and the disabled people who are dying. And so it's a really personal issue for us. There's no way you can separate these issues because they're very tricky, nuanced kind of issues. There's issues with huge rates of depression from any community of people, including disability communities, First Nation communities, communities of people with diverse sexualities. There's really, people face oppression, and that informs their mental health. And I'm in Western Australia, so this is a very personal issue for me as well.
Absolutely would be. And you say, so in the eligibility criteria, disability or mental illness does not prompt eligibility for it. But what you're saying is people can use the disease or the problem behind that disability or mental illness to make themselves eligible.
And there's a young person who's, I don't think yet 30, who's actually has my same diagnosis, which is a rare disease, who's lobbying for the pro-assisted dying community, who's saying, I'm dying of this condition. So for me, when I was first diagnosed, I'm old, I'm 52. So I didn't have a firm diagnosis as a younger person. And it is a terrifying thing when you have all these, perspectives around disability. But now I have 6 children. I have 2 grandchildren. I'm a youth leader. I've had a productive life, working and living a fun life, So I kind of, I have meaning in my life, and I just think, this is just a complicated issue, and it's really, really hard to have that complicated discussion around where the lines of disability start and where, palliative care is involved, and things like motor neurone disease are really hard for us to come to terms with, I think.
Thank you. And you certainly don't look old enough to have grandchildren from this end. Judith, we're talking about the elderly, the disabled. Where does the throwaway culture fit in here? Is that a concern of yours?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been, I'm in WA where everything is open because we locked down hard early. But I remember early on, there was a film that came out called Me Before You, which was about this romantic story where a quadriplegic decided to end his life at Dignitas. And Not Dead Yet and the disability community across the world protested around this film. And I remember we had a giant tin that we were, using as a prop. And I thought I was funny because we were going to the pub afterwards, and I shook it at a lady and said, I'm going to kill myself because, because of this movie, la, la, la. Would you like to donate to help in my death? And this woman put money in it. And so we did a social experiment, and nobody said no, for an hour. And I was horrified that, just because I was sitting down and I'm a wheelchair user, that nobody said, are you okay? What would you say to someone who was standing on the edge of a bridge and saying they wanted to end their life? Normally you'd put your hand out and you go, can I help you? Are you okay? Do anything that you could. And people were willing to actually facilitate my death because of their perception of disability. So yeah, it's I think the throwaway culture issue is a very, very real one. And ableism and that perception of what being disabled means is a really important one.
Judith?
Yeah, I haven't really thought of a lot in terms of the throwaway culture. I guess for a lot of people who support our access to assisted dying or assisted suicide, don't actually think about themselves being unwell. They're thinking in terms of, I'm well and I wouldn't like to be like that. And in their younger state, they can't actually say that. I think there's a huge, one of the things that I really worry about is, we've alluded to ignorance about the normal death process, but I think there's an awful lot of ignorance about what assisted dying involves and what it is. And that people think it's the equivalent of, say, turning off a respirator, or not having treatment, or not being able to use pain relief generously when someone is distressed. And that leads people to say, I want access to being knocked off because I don't want to go through that sort of distress. And they don't realise that there's already laws that enable, that allow doctors and others in the palliative care team to address that sort of distress.
So does making it law give it the imprimatur to do it, that it's okay?
Well, it does, yeah. I mean, people can access it without even being aware of what it is.
And are they accessing it because they think they can't see another way out?
They don't know that there's another way of approaching. Don't know about what palliative care can offer and what it can truly do in a team-like environment, accessing, as Philip referred to before, help in a whole lot of different ways for the different sorts of distress that come to people as they approach end of life.
What are you thinking, Philip?
Just in answer to the first question you asked about what does keep you awake at night and what your concerns are, I think my concerns are echoed by a lot of palliative care clinicians in Queensland, is that we all think there should be really excellent access to palliative care first. That should be the first thing that the government should be investing in. The government should have aims and goals to invest in palliative care to make it as good as possible for everyone in the state. And then when everyone in the state has state-of-the-art quality palliative care, that is a time perhaps to have a discussion about where does VAD fit. Like to have this discussion before that's in place seems very premature. I'll give you an example. So in Queensland, for example, access to palliative care really depends a lot on where you live. And you can't say everyone's got the same access whether they live in the city. People in different parts of Brisbane have different access to palliative care, let alone if you live in rural and regional and remote. And I remember clearly when the VAD legislation was coming into Victoria, and I was on a panel and a talk, and someone who was involved in the working committee to bring it in said that one of their goals was to enable everyone in Victoria, no matter where they live, to have equal access to VAD. And I said, that's really amazing that you would do that, because even in Victoria at the moment, not everyone in Victoria has equal access to palliative care. And so I guess as we're seeing like this thing about, Palliative Care Queensland, AMAQ and medical directors of Group of Queensland have put out that they really think that Queensland needs an extra $275 million a year to fully fund to really state-of-the-art palliative care. And one of the major parties has put out they'll fund an extra $25 million per year coming up. So the difference is that we see it as 99% of people will, 100% of people will want palliative care, and 1% of people will want VAD, perhaps if that. Like, it's really about trying to improve palliative care and try and improve and put money into that first to make it access for everyone.